I've always prided myself on being the kind of man who could read people. My career demanded it. As a senior consultant at a top-tier financial firm, my job was to delve into the intricacies of human behavior, analyze patterns, and predict outcomes. It was a skill I'd honed over years, becoming almost second nature. I could walk into a room, and within moments, I'd know who was hiding something, who was bluffing, and who was about to make a deal they'd regret. I lived and breathed strategy, calculation, and foresight. But despite my ability to see through the facades of others, there was one person whose motives and thoughts remained a mystery to me. My wife, Sarah. Sarah and I met over a decade ago at a corporate conference in Chicago, a setting as sterile as our initial conversations. At the time, I was just beginning my career, eager and driven, while Sarah was already making strides in her field, working in marketing for a major pharmaceutical company. I was drawn to her almost immediately. She was unlike anyone I'd ever met, sharp, witty, and with a confidence that was both intimidating and irresistibly attractive. We spent hours talking about everything from market trends to our shared love of art, and by the end of that week, I was smitten. We were inseparable, and within a year, we were married. Ours was a marriage that others envied. We were the epitome of a power couple, both ambitious, both successful, both driven by a desire to climb higher and achieve more. We bought a house in a picturesque suburb, the kind of place that screamed success. It was a beautiful home, with a garden that Sarah meticulously cared for, while I took pride in the perfectly maintained lawn. We hosted dinner parties for our friends and colleagues, where I would regale them with stories from the financial world, and Sarah would charm them with her warmth and intelligence. On the surface, everything was perfect. We had built a life that others only dreamed of. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that I was too blind, or perhaps too arrogant, to see. My work demanded long hours. I spent most of my days locked in my office, buried under mountains of data, consumed by the relentless pursuit of success. Sarah, on the other hand, had recently transitioned to working from home. She had started her own consulting business, advising pharmaceutical companies on their marketing strategies. It was a move I supported wholeheartedly, proud of her entrepreneurial spirit. But with her new venture came a level of freedom and flexibility that I didn't have. She set her own hours, took meetings when it suited her, and often worked late into the night, long after I had gone to bed. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were both busy people, and our careers were demanding. It wasn't unusual for us to miss dinner together, or for one of us to be working while the other slept. But then, small things started to change. Sarah became more distant, more preoccupied. She would sit at the dinner table, staring off into space, barely touching her food. When I asked her what was on her mind, she'd smile and say it was just work, nothing to worry about. I wanted to believe her, so I did. After all, I was too busy with my own work to press the issue, but the signs were there, growing more apparent with each passing day. Sarah started spending more time on her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with a speed and intensity that felt out of place. She was always texting someone she never mentioned by name. Whenever I asked who she was talking to, she'd give me a quick, dismissive answer. Just a friend, or a client. And then she'd change the subject, asking about my day or reminding me of some trivial household matter that needed attention. I let it go, not wanting to seem paranoid, but the seed of doubt had been planted. There were other changes too, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced over time. Sarah, who had always preferred comfort over fashion, suddenly began dressing differently. She started buying clothes that I'd never seen her wear before, tight skirts, low-cut blouses, dresses that clung to her body in ways that made me uncomfortable, not because I didn't find her attractive, but because it was so out of character. She'd apply her makeup with meticulous care, spending hours in front of the mirror, even on days when she wasn't leaving the house. I told myself she was just experimenting with a new look, maybe trying to reinvent herself, as she grew into her new role as a business owner. But there was something about the way she looked at herself in the mirror, a self-assuredness that felt almost like she was seeing herself through someone else's eyes. Then there were the nights out with her friends. Sarah had always been sociable, but her outings became more frequent, and her stories about them more vague. She'd tell me she was meeting up with her girlfriends, but she'd come home late, sometimes well past midnight, smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers. When I asked how her night was, she'd give me a quick smile and say it was fine, but the faraway look in her eyes told a different story. She'd slip into bed beside me, her back turned, as if the night out had exhausted her beyond words. Our sex life, once vibrant and passionate, had become a mere shadow of what it used to be. We still had sex, but it was different now, mechanical, almost robotic. It felt like a chore, something she did out of obligation rather than desire. Gone were the passionate embraces, the whispered confessions of love. In their place was a cold, distant routine that left me feeling more alone than I ever had, even when we were lying next to each other. I'd reach out for her in the dark, hoping to feel the warmth of her body. But she'd turn away, mumbling something about being tired, leaving me to stare up at the ceiling, wondering where we had gone wrong. I tried to tell myself that it was just a rough patch, that every marriage went through ups and downs. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The distance between us was growing, and no matter how hard I tried to bridge the gap, it only seemed to widen. The turning point came one evening, after another long day at the office. I had just come home, exhausted, hoping to unwind with a glass of whiskey and some mindless TV. But as soon as I walked through the door, I knew something was off. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. Sarah was usually home by now, but the lights were off, and there was no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no answer. A wave of unease washed over me as I walked through the house, checking each room, hoping to find her asleep on the couch or in the shower. But she wasn't there. I tried calling her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe she had gone out for a walk or was running an errand. But as the minutes ticked by, that uneasy feeling in my gut only grew stronger. And then, just as I was about to call the police, I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. I watched from the window as she got out of the car, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she was trying to compose herself. She didn't see me standing there, watching her as she took a deep breath, adjusted her hair, and then walked towards the front door. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want her to know that I had seen her. I didn't want her to see the doubt in my eyes. So I sat down on the couch, pretending to be absorbed in the TV when she walked in. "Hey," she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too cheerful. "Sorry I'm late. Work ran long." I nodded, forcing a smile. "No problem. I was just relaxing." She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, her lips cool against my skin, before heading upstairs to change. I watched her go, my mind racing. There was something off about her tonight, something in the way she moved, the way she avoided my gaze. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Sarah's phone was on the nightstand, her usual lifeline, but the screen was cracked, a jagged line running through it like a scar. She never let her phone out of her sight, so seeing it there, damaged and abandoned, struck me as odd. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, my thumb brushing against the cracked glass. I knew I shouldn't invade her privacy, but the temptation was too strong. I unlocked the phone, my heart pounding as I scrolled through her messages, looking for something, anything, that might explain the growing distance between us. But the messages were mundane. Conversations with her friends, work emails, nothing out of the ordinary. I was about to put the phone down when I noticed a message thread labeled J. It was buried beneath dozens of other messages, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. I hesitated for a moment before tapping on the thread, my curiosity getting the better of me. The messages were brief, cryptic, things like, "Last night was amazing," and "Can't wait to see you again." My blood ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so I started paying closer attention. I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for, maybe just some reassurance that my suspicions were unfounded. But the more I observed, the more the nagging doubt in the back of my mind grew. It started with the phone. Sarah had always been the type to leave her phone lying around, not particularly concerned about it. But lately, it had become a permanent fixture in her hand. She carried it with her everywhere, even to the bathroom, and if she wasn't holding it, it was tucked away in her purse, never left out in the open. One evening, as we sat in the living room watching TV, I noticed how she kept glancing at it, her fingers twitching as if she was itching to check it. Eventually, she gave in, unlocking the screen and smiling at whatever she saw. I tried to catch a glimpse of what was on the screen, but she angled it away from me. "Who's that?" I asked casually, keeping my tone light. "Just a friend," she replied without looking up, her voice nonchalant. But there was a hint of something else there, something I couldn't quite place. "Work stuff, nothing exciting." I nodded, pretending to be engrossed in the show. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched her fingers dance across the screen, typing out a message. She glanced over at me, as if to make sure I wasn't watching, then quickly locked the phone and set it face down on the armrest. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it set off alarms in my head. That weekend, Sarah mentioned she was meeting up with some old friends from work for dinner. She didn't give me many details, just said it was a girls' night out and that I shouldn't wait up. I spent most of that Saturday working on a report, but her casual mention of plans lingered in my mind. By the time she was getting ready to go out, my curiosity had turned into a gnawing sense of unease. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching as she rifled through her closet, pulling out outfits and discarding them one by one. The bed was soon covered in a heap of clothes. I couldn't help but notice that she was choosing items she hadn't worn in a while. Tighter dresses, higher heels, things that made her look stunning but had always seemed too flashy for a casual dinner with friends. "You look amazing," I said, leaning against the doorframe, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Thanks," she replied with a quick smile, slipping into a sleek black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. She turned to the mirror, adjusting her hair, her expression unreadable. "Where are you guys going?" I asked, attempting to sound as if I was making small talk. "Just a new restaurant downtown," she said, her eyes focused on her reflection as she applied a final touch of lipstick. Someplace new that Emily wanted to try. Her answer was vague, and it left me with more questions than answers. I knew Emily. She was a mutual friend, and they'd gone out together plenty of times before, but something about the way Sarah mentioned her felt forced, like she was trying too hard to make it sound casual. "Mind if I join you?" "I could use a night out," I said, testing the waters. Sarah froze for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but I caught it. Then she turned to me smiling, but her eyes were a little too wide, her smile a little too tight. "Oh, it's just going to be the girls tonight. I don't want to bore you with our gossip." "Right," I said, forcing a laugh. "Another time, then." She kissed me quickly on the cheek and grabbed her purse. "Don't wait up, okay? I might be late." I watched her leave, the front door closing with a soft click. The moment she was gone, I felt the tension in my chest loosen, only to be replaced by a dull ache of uncertainty. I walked back to the living room, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat down on the couch. The TV droned on in the background, but I wasn't paying attention. My mind kept replaying our conversation, dissecting every word, every glance. Something wasn't right. The hours dragged by, and I couldn't focus on anything. The beer sat untouched on the coffee table as I stared blankly at the screen, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, but the gnawing feeling in my gut wouldn't let me rest. Around midnight, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I stayed where I was, listening as Sarah fumbled with the lock and then entered the house. She moved quietly, tiptoeing almost, as if she didn't want to wake me. I heard the rustle of her clothes as she slipped off her heels and made her way to the bedroom. I waited a few minutes, then got up and followed her. The door to our bedroom was slightly ajar, and I peered in, watching as she carefully hung up her dress in the closet, her movements slow and deliberate. She was wearing one of her old nightgowns, a loose, comfortable thing that didn't match the glamour of the dress she'd worn out. She caught sight of me in the mirror and jumped, her hand flying to her chest. "Jesus, you scared me," she whispered, turning around with a nervous laugh. "Sorry," I said, stepping into the room. "I didn't mean to." She forced a smile, but there was something off about it. "Didn't I tell you not to wait up?" "I couldn't sleep," I lied, my eyes scanning her face for any signs of deception. But she looked away, busying herself with tidying up the room, as if to avoid my gaze. "Had a good time?" I asked, leaning against the dresser. "Yeah, it was nice," she said, her voice flat, almost rehearsed. She didn't offer any details, didn't mention who was there or what they talk. Ed about, just moved on to brushing her hair. I stood there for a moment, watching her, trying to decide if I should push her for more details. But something held me back, a sense that if I pressed too hard, I'd cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. So I let it go, at least for the moment. As she slipped into bed, I noticed her phone sitting on the nightstand. The screen was dark, the familiar glow of notifications absent. I stared at it for a long time, wondering who she had been texting so intently earlier and why there were no messages now. But I didn't ask. Instead, I climbed into bed beside her, keeping my distance, both physically and emotionally. The next morning, Sarah was up before me, already dressed and in the kitchen making coffee. I watched her from the doorway, noticing how she moved with a nervous energy, her hands slightly trembling as she poured the steaming liquid into her mug. "Early start?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, I've got a lot to do today," she replied without looking up, her voice tight. She seemed distracted, barely acknowledging me as I joined her at the table. She kept glancing at the clock, as if she couldn't wait to leave the house. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, but the tension in the room was palpable, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. As she headed out the door, she paused, looking back at me with an unreadable expression. "See you tonight?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes betraying a hint of something darker. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. She lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more, but then she just nodded and left, the door closing behind her with a soft thud. I sat there in silence, the house feeling empty without her. The doubts that had been simmering in the back of my mind were now at a full boil, and I knew I couldn't ignore them any longer. Something was going on, something that Sarah wasn't telling me, and I was determined to find out what it was. But as I stood up to start my day, a part of me wondered if I really wanted to know the truth. Because once I opened that door, there would be no going back. The gnawing doubt had festered long enough. By the time the next weekend rolled around, I was done playing the passive husband, sitting on the sidelines while my life unraveled before my eyes. Something had changed in Sarah, and it wasn't just in my head. I needed answers, and I was prepared to go to any lengths to get them. That Saturday, Sarah mentioned she had another girls' night planned. The same vague details, dinner at a new spot downtown with Emily and a few others. I nodded, pretending to accept her story, but inside, I was planning my next move. This time, I wasn't going to sit around wondering. I was going to find out the truth. Sarah left the house around 7, dressed to the nines in a red dress I'd never seen before. She looked stunning, but the sight of her didn't fill me with pride like it once did. Now, all I felt was a sick twist of anxiety in my gut. I watched her drive away from the living room window, waiting until her car disappeared around the corner before grabbing my keys and heading out the door. I'd anticipated this moment, and a few days earlier, I'd installed a GPS tracker on Sarah's car. I knew it was crossing a line, but I was past caring about boundaries. I needed to know where she was really going, and this was the only way to find out. I pulled up the tracking app on my phone and watched as the little dot that represented her car moved steadily across the map. She didn't head downtown like she'd said. Instead, she drove to a different part of the city, one I wasn't familiar with. I followed the route carefully, staying several blocks behind her, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Finally, the dot stopped in front of a modest apartment building on the other side of town. I parked my car a short distance away, watching as Sarah stepped out of her vehicle and walked towards the entrance. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her disappear inside the building, a small part of me still hoping that I was wrong, that there was some innocent explanation for all of this. But I couldn't let it go. I needed to see for myself. I waited a few minutes, then got out of my car and approached the building. It was an old, rundown place, the kind that had seen better days. The door was slightly ajar, and I slipped inside, taking care not to make any noise. The hallway was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that reminded me of forgotten places. I followed the faint sound of voices coming from one of the apartments on the second floor, my pulse quickening with every step. When I reached the door, I paused, pressing my ear against the wood. I could hear muffled laughter, followed by the sound of glasses clinking. It didn't sound like a girls' night. It sounded like a private party, one I hadn't been invited to. I was about to knock when I heard Sarah's voice, clearer now, almost teasing. "I've missed you," she said, her tone soft and intimate. The response was a low murmur, too quiet for me to make out, but the implication was clear. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. There was another man in that apartment, and Sarah wasn't here for a friendly visit. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I knew I was about to cross a line, but at this point, I didn't care. I needed to see it with my own eyes, needed to confirm the betrayal that I'd been dreading for so long. The door was unlocked, and it swung open with a soft creak. I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest as I took in the scene before me. The apartment was small, cluttered with mismatched furniture and stacks of books. In the center of the living room was a couch, and on that couch sat Sarah, my Sarah, straddling a man I didn't recognize. She was laughing, her hands tangled in his hair as she leaned in to kiss him, completely unaware of my presence. The man, tall, muscular, with a cocky grin on his face, had his hands on her hips, pulling her closer as if they couldn't get enough of each other. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in place, unable to process what I was seeing. It felt like time had stopped, like I was watching a scene from someone else's life. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening to me. But it was. The sound of the door closing behind me must have alerted them, because Sarah suddenly pulled back, her laughter dying in her throat as she turned to see me standing there. Her eyes widened in shock, her face draining of color as she scrambled off the man's lap, her hands shaking as she tried to straighten her dress. "John," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on her, on the way she stood there, looking guilty and terrified, like a child caught doing something they knew was wrong. But there was no innocence here, just betrayal, plain and simple. The man on the couch looked between us, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't seem the least bit concerned that I'd walked in on them. In fact, he looked almost amused, like this was just another day for him. "Who the fuck is this?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the man beat her to it, standing up and casually buttoning his shirt as he approached me. "I'm Jason," he said, offering his hand like we were meeting at a cocktail party. "And you must be the husband." I stared at his outstretched hand, the absurdity of the situation almost making me laugh. But there was no humor in this, just cold, hard reality. I ignored his hand and looked back at Sarah, who was standing there, her eyes filling with tears. "John, I can explain," she started, but I cut her off. "Explain?" I snapped, my voice rising. "What the hell is there to explain, Sarah? I'm standing here watching you with another man and you want to explain?" She flinched at the harshness in my tone, but I didn't care. I was beyond caring. All the pent-up frustration, the doubt, the anger, it all came boiling to the surface, and I couldn't hold it back any longer. "You lied to me," I continued, stepping closer to her. "You've been lying to me for God knows how long. All those nights you said you were working late, all those girls' nights, was it all just an excuse to sneak off and fuck this guy?" Sarah's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head. "No, it wasn't like that. I didn't mean for this to happen." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the small room. "Didn't mean for this to happen? You're standing here in another man's apartment, and you didn't mean for this to happen?" Jason, who had been watching our exchange with mild interest, finally stepped in. "Hey man, calm down. Let's not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be." That was it. The last straw. I lunged at him, all rational thought gone as I grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. His smug expression faltered for the first time as he struggled against my grip. "You think this isn't a big deal?" I hissed through clenched teeth, my face inches from his. "You think you can just fuck another man's wife and walk away like nothing happened?" "John, stop!" Sarah screamed, trying to pull me off him, but I was too far gone. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, the anger pounding in my veins. I wanted to hurt him, wanted to make him feel the same pain that was tearing me apart inside. But before I could do anything more, Jason twisted out of my grip and shoved me back, his eyes flashing with anger now. "Back off, man!" he shouted, his voice full of bravado. "She's the one who came to me. You should be talking to her, not me." That stopped me cold. I stood there breathing heavily, my fists clenched at my sides as I stared at Sarah. She was sobbing now, her hands covering her face, her whole body shaking with the force of her cries. The reality of it all crashed down on me in that moment. This wasn't just some mistake, some one-time lapse in judgment. This was a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice that Sarah had made. She had chosen him over me, chosen to betray the vows we had made to each other, and I didn't know if I could ever forgive her for that. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the apartment, the sound of Sarah's sobs echoing in my ears as I left her behind. The drive home felt like a blur, as if I were on autopilot. My mind was a chaotic storm of emotions, anger, disbelief, betrayal, and a deep, gut-wrenching pain that I couldn't escape. It took everything I had just to keep the car on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles ached. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a long time, the engine still running, staring blankly at the darkened windows of our house. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a prison, the walls closing in on me even from the outside. I could still see Sarah's tear-streaked face, hear her desperate pleas echoing in my head, but they felt distant, almost like they belonged to someone else's life. Finally, I turned off the engine and got out of the car. The night was cool, a sharp contrast to the heat still burning in my chest. I needed to do something, anything, to distract myself from the whirlwind of thoughts threatening to consume me. I walked around to the backyard. The garden that Sarah had once loved so much now looked neglected in the dim light. The roses she had painstakingly planted and cared for were wilting, much like our marriage, and I found myself standing there, staring at them, feeling an odd sense of kinship with those dying flowers. I couldn't go inside, couldn't face the emptiness of our home. So I paced the yard, the soft crunch of gravel under my shoes, the only sound in the stillness of the night. I was trying to make sense of it all, but the more I thought about it, the more tangled my thoughts became. How long had this been going on? How many lies had she told me? How many times had I been the fool, thinking everything was fine while she was with him? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, each one pecking away at my sanity. I clenched my fists, the anger boiling over again as I pictured Jason's smug face, his condescending tone. He had looked at me like I was the intruder, like I was the one who didn't belong. And Sarah, she had chosen him, over me, over the life we had built together. I needed answers. I needed to understand how we had ended up here, on opposite sides of a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. But more than that, I needed to confront her, to make her face the reality of what she had done. With a deep breath, I finally forced myself to go inside. The house was eerily quiet, the shadows long and deep as I moved through the hallway, flipping on lights as I went. I ended up in the kitchen, standing in front of the sink, staring out the window at the darkened yard. My mind was a million miles away, replaying the events of the night over and over until they became a blur of pain and rage. I had just started to wonder if she would even come home when I heard the front door creak open. My heart rate spiked, and I turned slowly, bracing myself for what was to come. I could hear her hesitant footsteps as she made her way towards the kitchen, each one sending a jolt of anxiety through me. When Sarah appeared in the doorway, she looked as if she had aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying, and she seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of what had happened had physically diminished her. She paused when she saw me standing there, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. "John," she began, her voice shaky and uncertain. "Please let me explain." I didn't say anything, just watched her, waiting. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until she finally broke it, her voice trembling as she tried to justify the unjustifiable. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, her eyes pleading with me to understand. "It just happened. I don't know how things got so out of control." "That's your explanation?" I asked, my voice cold, barely controlled. "It just happened? How long, Sarah? How long have you been lying to me?" She flinched at the accusation, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "It started a few months ago. At first it was just texts, emails. I didn't think it would go anywhere, but then things changed." "Things changed?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "You mean you decided to start fucking him?" Sarah winced as if I had slapped her, but I wasn't in the mood to soften the blow. I wanted her to feel every ounce of the pain she had inflicted on me. I took a step closer, closing the distance between us, the fury I had kept at bay threatening to spill over. "Why, Sarah?" I demanded, my voice rising with each word. "Why him? Why now? Was I not enough for you? Was our life not good enough?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she shook her head, her words coming out in a desperate rush. "It's not like that, John. I love you. I never stopped loving you. But something was missing. We were drifting apart, and I felt so alone. Jason, he made me feel wanted again, like I was alive." "Alive?" I spat, the word filled with venom. "So you throw away everything we've built together for a cheap thrill? You think that justifies betraying me?" "No!" she cried, her voice breaking. "I don't expect you to understand. I don't even understand it myself. But I was lost, and he was there when I needed someone." I stared at her, disbelief and disgust warring within me. I had known something was wrong, but to hear her admit it, to hear her say that she had turned to another man because I wasn't enough, it was like a knife twisting in my gut. "I trusted you," I said, my voice shaking with the force of my emotions. I believed in you, in us, and you destroyed that trust. For what? A few stolen moments with someone who doesn't give a damn about you? Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off, the anger bubbling over. Do you know what it feels like to walk in on your wife with another man? To see her in his arms, laughing, kissing him, like our marriage means nothing? Do you have any idea what that does to a person? She shook her head, sobbing openly now, but I wasn't done. You've made a fool out of me, Sarah. You've turned our life, our marriage, into a joke. And for what? A man who's probably done this 100 times before? Do you really think you're special to him? Do you think he's going to be there for you when the thrill wears off? Sarah's sobs grew louder, but I couldn't stop the torrent of words pouring out of me. All the pain, all the humiliation, everything I had kept bottled up was spilling out now, and there was no way to stop it. I gave you everything, Sarah. I gave you my heart, my soul, and this is how you repay me? With lies and betrayal? You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. She dropped to her knees, covering her face with her hands as she cried uncontrollably, her entire body shaking with the force of her sobs. I watched her, feeling nothing but a hollow emptiness where my love for her used to be. I had thought I could handle the truth, but now that I had it, I realized it was more than I could bear. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sarah behind, crumpled on the floor, her cries echoing through the house. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Not with her. Not after everything that had happened. As I walked out into the night, the cool air hitting my face, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The life I had known, the woman I had loved, it was all gone, shattered by the betrayal that had ripped through our marriage like a hurricane. And as I walked away, the only thought in my mind was how I would ever pick up the pieces. The night air felt like a slap in the face, sharp and cold, pulling me out of the numbness that had settled over me in the kitchen. I walked down the driveway, away from the house, from the wreckage of my life, with no clear direction in mind. I just needed to move, to get away from the suffocating reality of what had just happened. The streets were empty, the suburban quietness broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant hum of a passing car. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I wandered aimlessly, my mind replaying the night's events in a torturous loop. I must have walked for miles, my thoughts churning in a chaotic storm that I couldn't escape. The image of Sarah with Jason was burned into my brain, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. I could still see the way she had looked at him, the way she had kissed him, so full of affection, so full of the life that she had denied me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, and it made me sick to my core. Eventually, I found myself at a small park, a place Sarah and I had visited often in happier times. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat down on one of the benches, the memories of our walks here now tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. I buried my face in my hands, the cold metal of my wedding ring pressing against my forehead as I fought to keep my emotions in check. But it was no use. The pain was too overwhelming, too raw. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of my own despair. How had it come to this? We had built a life together, a life that I thought was solid, unbreakable. We had shared our dreams, our fears, our deepest secrets. And yet, somewhere along the way, we had lost each other. Or maybe I had just lost her, and I had been too blind to see it until it was too late. Hours must have passed as I sat there, lost in the depths of my sorrow. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. I watched the sunrise in silence, the beauty of it doing nothing to lift the heavy weight in my chest. It was like the world was moving on, indifferent to the destruction that had taken place in my life. As the morning light grew brighter, I finally stood up, feeling the stiffness in my limbs from sitting so long. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't go back to the house. Not yet. The thought of facing Sarah, of seeing her tear-streaked face again, was more than I could handle. I needed to get away, to clear my head. I pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up with missed calls and texts from Sarah. I didn't read them. I couldn't. Instead, I dialed a number I hadn't used in years, hoping against hope that it was still in service. Hello? The voice on the other end was groggy, thick with sleep. David, I said, my voice hoarse from the hours of silence. It's John, I need a favor. There was a pause, then the sound of rustling sheets as David sat up in bed. John? Jesus, man, it's been a while. What's going on? I need a place to stay. Just for a few days. David was silent for a moment, probably trying to process the unexpected request. Yeah, of course. Come on over. Do you need me to pick you up? No, I'm fine, I'll drive. My voice was steadier now, the decision to leave giving me some small measure of control. I'll explain everything when I get there. Okay, David said, his voice laced with concern. Take your time. I'll be here. I hung up and pocketed the phone, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. David and I had been close friends in college, but we had drifted apart over the years as our lives took different paths. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years, but I knew I could count on him. He was the kind of friend who would be there, no questions asked, when you needed him. The drive to David's place was long, and the roads were mercifully empty. The city was just beginning to wake up, and the early morning light bathed everything in a soft, golden hue. But the beauty of the sunrise was lost on me. My mind was still consumed by the events of the previous night, the enormity of what I had just discovered. Every mile I drove away from my home felt like another nail in the coffin of my marriage. When I finally pulled into David's driveway, he was already standing outside, waiting for me. He looked much the same as I remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, with a mop of unruly dark hair and a friendly, open face. But as soon as he saw me step out of the car, his expression changed to one of deep concern. John, you look like hell, he said, crossing the driveway in a few quick strides to meet me. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. Come on inside. Let's get you sorted out. I followed him into the house, the familiar comfort of David's presence doing little to ease the turmoil inside me. His place was just as I remembered, warm, welcoming, with the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. But I couldn't appreciate it. All I could think about was Sarah, and the fact that I had just walked out on my life. David led me to the kitchen and poured us both a cup of coffee. I took mine gratefully, the warmth of the mug grounding me somewhat, but I still couldn't bring myself to speak. David seemed to sense that I needed time, so he just sat down across from me, waiting patiently for me to start. When I finally spoke, my voice was low, almost a whisper. She cheated on me, David. Sarah, she's been seeing someone else. David's eyes widened in shock, his coffee cup pausing halfway to his lips. Jesus, John, I'm so sorry. I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in my throat. I caught them together last night. I didn't know what else to do, so I left. I couldn't stay there. David set down his cup, leaning forward with a serious expression. You did the right thing. If you needed to get out of there, then you did what you had to do. Do you want to talk about it? I shook my head, not ready to delve into the details just yet. I just need some time to think, to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do now. David nodded, his expression understanding. Take as much time as you need. You're welcome to stay here for as long as you want. Thanks, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I appreciate it. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of my confession hanging heavily between us. David didn't push me to talk, for which I was grateful. I wasn't sure I had the strength to go over it all again, to relive the horror of walking in on Sarah and Jason. Eventually, David stood up and patted me on the back. I've got to head to work soon, but you're welcome to make yourself at home. There's food in the fridge, and the guest room's all yours. Just take care of yourself, okay? I nodded, grateful for his understanding. I will. Thanks, David. He gave me a small smile, then headed out, leaving me alone in the quiet of his kitchen. I sat there for a long time, staring into my coffee, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had lost and what I would do next. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see a way forward. Everything I had known, everything I had believed in, was gone. And I didn't know how to start picking up the pieces. The night air stung my face as I drove, my mind numb to everything except the raw, searing pain that had taken hold of my heart. It had been days since I'd walked out of the house, since I had confronted Sarah and left her crying on the kitchen floor. Days spent in a haze of anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I had stayed with David, a friend who had taken me in without question, but no amount of time or distance had dulled the ache inside me. I had hoped that getting away from Sarah would help me clear my head, but instead, it had only made the reality of her betrayal more unbearable. As I drove through the darkened streets, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat, breaking the silence that filled the car. I glanced at it, expecting another text from Sarah, another message begging me to come home, to talk to her, to try and salvage what was left of our marriage. But it wasn't Sarah. It was a text from David. "John, where are you? You need to get back to the house. Now." My heart skipped a beat, dread creeping into my chest. I immediately called him back, the phone ringing in my ear as I tried to keep my hand steady on the wheel. David answered on the first ring. "John, where the hell are you?" "I'm on my way back," I said, my voice tight with anxiety. "What's going on?" "It's Sarah," he said, his voice grim. "She's here. She showed up at the house a little while ago. She's not in good shape, John. You need to get here, fast." The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the road ahead blurring as David's words sank in. "What do you mean she's not in good shape? What happened?" "She's been drinking," David said, his voice low. "A lot. She's hysterical, John. She's talking about how sorry she is, how she didn't mean to hurt you, but she's also saying some things that, well, I think she's in a bad place. I don't think she's thinking straight." A cold chill ran down my spine. I pressed the gas pedal harder, my mind racing with possibilities. "I'm almost there. Just keep her safe until I get back." I hung up and drove the rest of the way in a blur of fear and adrenaline. The thought of Sarah, the woman I had loved for so long, in such a state, it was more than I could bear. No matter how much she had hurt me, I couldn't stand the thought of something happening to her. When I finally pulled into David's driveway, I barely had time to turn off the engine before I was out of the car and running to the front door. It was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, my heart pounding in my chest as I stepped inside. "David?" I called out, my voice echoing through the hallway. "In here!" David's voice came from the living room, tense and urgent. I rushed in to find David standing near the couch, his face etched with worry. And there, slumped on the couch, was Sarah. She looked like a ghost of the woman I had known, her hair disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her eyes red and swollen from crying. An empty bottle of whiskey lay on the floor beside her, and her eyes were glassy, unfocused. "John," she mumbled, her voice slurred. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out, and she collapsed back onto the couch. "John, I'm so sorry." I knelt beside her, my hands trembling as I reached out to steady her. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing? You shouldn't be here." "I didn't mean to," she sobbed, her words barely coherent. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted you to love me." "Sarah, you need to calm down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We can talk about this, but not like this. You're drunk, and you're not thinking clearly." She shook her head, her tears falling faster now. "I don't deserve you. I don't deserve anything. I ruined everything." I glanced up at David, who was watching us with concern. "We need to get her to a hospital," I said quietly. "She needs help." But before I could say anything more, Sarah suddenly lunged forward, grabbing onto my arm with surprising strength. "No, John, please. I don't want to go to a hospital. I just want to be with you. I don't want to be alone." Her desperation cut through me like a knife. This wasn't the strong, confident woman I had married. This was someone who had been broken, shattered by her own guilt and regret. And as much as I wanted to pull away, to protect myself from the pain she had caused, I couldn't leave her like this. Okay, I said, trying to calm her down. "But you need to sober up, Sarah. We can't talk about anything while you're like this." She nodded weakly, her grip on my arm loosening as she slumped back onto the couch. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her eyes closing as exhaustion overtook her. I sat there beside her, my mind reeling. I had come to David's house to escape the nightmare that my life had become, but now it was all crashing down around me. Sarah's betrayal, her remorse, and now her breakdown, it was all too much. I didn't know how to handle it, how to process the whirlwind of emotions that were tearing me apart. For a while, the room was silent, save for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. I could feel David's eyes on me, waiting for me to say something, to do something. But I didn't know what to say or do. I was lost, drowning in the chaos that my life had become. Suddenly, Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she looked up at me. There was a strange, wild look in her eyes, and for a moment I didn't recognize her. "John," she said softly, her voice trembling, I can't live with myself. Not after what I've done." A chill ran down my spine, the fear in her voice slicing through my daze. "Sarah, don't talk like that," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We'll get through this. We just need time." But she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, John, you don't understand. I can't take it anymore. I can't." Panic surged through me as I realized what she was saying. I grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at me. "Sarah, no, don't even think like that. We'll figure this out. We'll get you help." But she was already pulling away from me, her movements frantic, erratic. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice broken. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted this." And before I could stop her, she stumbled to her feet and bolted for the door. I jumped up to follow her, my heart racing with fear, but I was too late. She was already outside, running down the driveway, her figure illuminated by the harsh light of the street lamp. "Sarah!" I shouted, chasing after her. But she was moving too fast, her desperation driving her forward. I heard the screech of tires before I saw the car, the blinding headlights cutting through the darkness. Sarah didn't stop, didn't even slow down, and in that split second I knew what was about to happen. "Sarah, no!" But it was too late. The impact was brutal, the sound of metal against flesh a sickening crunch that echoed through the night. The car screeched to a halt, and Sarah's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless and still. Time seemed to freeze as I stood there, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The driver of the car, a young man, jumped out, his face pale with shock as he stared at Sarah's motionless form. "Oh my God, I didn't see her," he stammered, but his words barely registered. All I could see was Sarah, lying there in the middle of the road, her body twisted and broken. The woman I had loved, the woman who had betrayed me, was gone. Just like that, she was gone. David was suddenly beside me, his hands gripping my shoulders, his voice urgent as he tried to pull me back from the scene. "John, you need to step back. Let me call an ambulance." But I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I could only stare at the shattered remains of my life lying before me, the final blow in a nightmare that had no end. The world around me blurred, the sounds fading into a distant hum as the weight of it all came crashing down on me. Sarah was gone. The woman who had been my everything, who had been a part of my life for so long, was gone. And I was left standing there, alone in the wreckage of a life that would never be the same. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached, but I barely heard them. All I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking, the pain too deep, too overwhelming to comprehend. And in that moment, as I stood there in the cold, unforgiving light of the street lamp,